Hello and welcome, class. My name is CP Moreau. I'm your TA, and I'll be talking today with you about collaborative writing. So the app I'm using is called Loom. It just keeps the presence of me here along with the lecture to make it a little more personal. And I'll just minimize myself up here for the remainder of the lecture. So what are we going to cover in this mini module today? There are 4 things, and they're all related to this notion of team writing. And so before I show you our agenda for the module, have a big picture view of what writing can be in your team. So it can definitely include a formal paper, but think of all the different ways that writing shows up in your team projects, whether it's a shared Google Doc or team minutes, or sketching out ideas together. So writing can be broad. So the first thing we're going to do is just have you give a little think on what your experiences with teams are typically like when we think about academic team projects. Then we're going to look at problems with team writing, looking at professional examples as well as student examples. And then we're going to kind of give some emphasis to what I'm teaching today by showing you how the practices that you can learn are expected by employers and why this should matter to you. And then finally, showing you the options you have when you have a team that you're writing together with. So the first item, as I mentioned, is just take a minute to informally reflect on your team experiences. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you can go ahead and pause the video and then pick up again after you've thought through examples of team experiences you've had in the past. Okay, so hopefully you have in the back of your mind some of those team experiences you've had, whether in high school or in college, that you're coming to this module with. So with that said, let's jump into it. Teamwork module number 1, approaches to team writing. So what's the problem? The first thing you'll need to see to kind of motivate your learning here is that typically when people are put on teams, they think, okay, now you're on a team, it's off to the races. And so you weren't assigned to read this text, but a large part of this lecture comes from a research article I read where the researcher studied a group of students who were in a capstone project that took place from spring semester. They did an internship in the summer and then finished up in that next fall. And so in this study, she studied a group of students with the intention that she was going to have a paper on what best practices were like for teamwork. But as this title suggests on the slide, that was not the case. It's the anatomy of a dysfunctional team. And so here's one of those students she interviewed speaking about that team experience. She says, I think, what have I been doing? I mean, what was I supposed to learn? Was I supposed to learn something from this? And so this is the opposite of what we want you to have on your teams this semester when you're working with one another. The learning should be clear, and it should also be clear what it is you're supposed to be doing. And so we're working to equip you with some tools to avoid this type of mentality. So first, some context of the study. The place they were working with was an engineering company, 650 employees. It was more of an R&D setup with 11 different departments, and the department that this team was on was environmental technology, and they were involved in what's called tech transfer. And so if you're not familiar with technology transfer as a business model, it's taking novel technology from research from universities and trying to transfer it into the workplace. So dealing with moving novel technology into the marketplace, and that's how this company makes money. And so the team that the students were assigned on was called Integrated Design for Manufacturing and Marketing. And it lasted from spring to fall, as mentioned, and it used this model. You don't need to know this, but in case some of you are engineers, you may encounter this elsewhere. Concurrent engineering model is a design method where different stages are ran simultaneously versus consecutively. So instead of doing one model and building up like this, consecutively. There's lots of processes going on at the same time. So the takeaway is a very large organization with lots of moving parts, lots of potential for problems to occur. And there were 13 students. And so when you're going into the workplace, and even sometimes in your academic classroom teams, there are expectations that your employer may have about you that you don't necessarily enact within that team. And so one takeaway from the study is that the employers and potentially your professors are going to assume you're going to assign to each other or volunteer for tasks appropriate to their areas of expertise, so that you're going to do work and that you're going to self-assign that work where needed. That you're also going to create a workable schedule on your own without prompting, and then actually complete the task that you set on the schedule. And so these are all the things that the boss it didn't even cross his mind to tell his student team to do these things. And you might read these and think, oh, this sounds pretty typical. I would do this. This wouldn't be an issue for me. But those 13 students, they weren't doing this work. And at least in this study, it became a little bit of a disaster, because when the boss did check in on the team, none of these things were present. So this should give you a little insight into a moment, thinking about reflecting on your own teamwork experiences from the beginning of the presentation. Were any of these things there or missing that could have made it better? So let's deepen the story a little bit more. So the problem was that the boss didn't sufficiently consider whether students had enough knowledge and experience to effectively collaborate. The team, on the other hand, was confused with a type of work that was being done. So the team did have a professional writer, a master's student on their team. And so this student, just as a matter of the way they're trained, was setting agendas, taking meeting minutes, and doing all sorts of kind of those procedural elements. And the other students, so those other 12 people on the team, assumed that she was the leader because she was kind of taking these roles that for her were second nature. But she actually had no knowledge of engineering dynamics or of tech transfer, and so she was not in a good place to be the leader for the team, and no one else was stepping up in that way as well. And so the other problem that the team had was that they weren't using any explicit collaboration model. And so before we get to those explicit collaboration models, let's kind of deepen the problem a little bit more. So the students didn't have theoretical knowledge or workplace experience to negotiate problems when they occurred. And so they kind of went into this project thinking, oh, when everything's done, when we think through everything, we can put it on paper. And so as students, you might think you have the technical expertise, and you may very well have the technical expertise, but you may not have the negotiation experience to negotiate teamwork issues. And so when you lack experience, you need to draw from a theoretical model until you accumulate enough experience. So this lecture is really giving you that theoretical shorthand that you can draw from when negotiating collaborative writing experiences in your teams. Okay, so what did the students learn at the end of this? Was that defining and describing rhetorical elements, language elements such as purpose, audience, and organization were important. So they couldn't just go in and do the technical solutions. They also had to spend time on planning, talking about and clarifying their purpose, who they were working towards, their customer audience, as well as what was the organization of the team of those 13 students. And then finally, productive teams really need to have internal mechanisms to monitor if they're doing work or not. And so in high school, you might have had a little more scaffolding from your teachers to make sure you're hitting deadlines and all of that. In college, you get less so. In the workplace, you have almost none. You have your quarterly objectives, if that, and then you have your annual review. And you need to be a self-perpetuating individual contributor, but also when you're on teams, you need to make sure that you have those checks in place to make sure the team is functioning as intended. So the bottom line from this research, to kind of motivate the learning here, and I'll read this aloud, is that collaborators who are going to be successful need to understand more than their disciplinary subject matter. They need the skill and sensitivity to communicate their socio-political context. So very academic word, socio-political context. What that really means is the social and the political world that you exist in as a member of a team. So there's a social element, you're working with other people, and there's a political element. You're negotiating goals, desires, and making compromises together. And that requires some political or rhetorical savvy to navigate through. So what I love about this study is it shows that you can't just put a group of interdisciplinary superstars into a room and come out with a great project. There's a lot more that goes into it in dealing with that socio-political context, and the rest of the lecture in this module is going to equip you and walk you through some methods to make sure that you don't end up like that dysfunctional team from the study. All right, so here we go into approaches to team writing. So there are three generally accepted methods for team writing. The first one is face-to-face. And so this is kind of, the team has just been assembled and they make a plan to meet. It sounds like a good idea. And they go in and meet to start doing the work. So as it says, face-to-face requires the most individual effort and produces the most tension. So that might be a surprise to some of you. Why is that? Well, there's collaboration happening, but there's no planning happening. And so tension ensues when teams kind of have to move back and forth between ideation, logistics, roles, goals, and planning. People are constantly negotiating that political element and reaffirming procedures rather than focusing on the task work. And so work can get done here, collaboration can happen in face-to-face, but it can also lead to kind of redoing work, reaffirming work, and kind of miscommunications down the line. So a second method is the divided approach. And so in the divided approach, this is typically what students do. You might even be thinking this is how you'll start off. And it's where the team members divide the project up into as many sections as there are group members and assemble those sections at the end of the project. And so this method involves the least amount of collaboration but the most amount of planning. And so why it's the least collaborative is because it's efficient, but the people aren't talking to each other. And so if you're not connecting points, there's no exchange of information, there's no discussion, there's no kind of taking advantage of the team by collecting other people's ideas and inputs into what it is you're working on. And as an instructor, what we see is the intention to turn in one completed paper through this kind of divide and conquer approach often is not what we see. What we see is three different papers written by three different authors. And so it's actually the least efficient method because it fails more often than it succeeds, because it leads to rewrites and last-minute struggles. And so in this kind of visual here, we have Tim, Stefan, and Charlotte. And so they're writing an IMRAD paper, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion or Conclusion. And so they thought, oh good, we'll just divide this up. We have three members. Charlotte's a go-getter. We'll give her two of those sections and tackle all of those, put it in a Google Doc, and submit it. And so that might be kind of the default way you're thinking you'll go about, but if Stefan isn't looking at Tim's intro, his methods aren't going to be informed. And if Charlotte is just making her conclusions based off the results, but not really linking it with the bigger picture from the introduction, those conclusions aren't going to really add up. And furthermore, maybe Charlotte has something to add to the introduction and Tim has something to add to the conclusion. And so the divided approach is efficient, but it produces the least quality work in general. So before I give you the third approach, which is the best practice, let's kind of deepen the problem a little bit, just to give you some more motivation for why to give the divided approach a second thought. So here's an interview I did with a student named Scotty, and this is not at the university to which you belong, but to a different one. And so I was doing an interview with a series of teams involved in a biotech company. And Scotty was an intern, so I interviewed people from interns to executives. And what I was interested in was how they navigated teamwork in that specific biotech company. So Scotty was interesting because he didn't have the experience that a lot of the professionals had, and so when he talked about experiences, they were often linked to college experiences. So I'm going to play for you this audio and take a listen with me as you hear how Scotty struggled with the divided method on his team. So the audio is a little bit choppy, but just hang in there till the end and take note of what pieces of his experience you pick up.
I think that happens a lot in group projects, especially when, like, for example, in some school projects, like, if like the day or two before we semester for a paper, like, you kind of, I wasn't supposed to write about this, someone was supposed to write about that, didn't have that, like, ongoing and like, not just like delegation of roles, but just awareness of so like there were things like that scenario that were just like lost, and I think.
Okay, so in that situation, how did you know? Did you discover that a problem had occurred when you looked at the final, or did you spidey
we met like 2 days before the final paper was due, and what we did was kind of like copy and paste all of our sections, and then once we read it through, total gap in like talking about this, we didn't have that, and then like two people's sections were basically exactly the same. And
what did you say in that moment once you discovered a problem?
Like, oh no, we gotta pretty much rewrite this whole thing.
Okay, so you heard from Scotty's experience that two people ended up writing pretty much the same material, and they had to do an all-nighter and rewrite a new paper using the face-to-face method the night before it was due. So that's probably not an ideal outcome that you want from your team, the all-nighter aspect, and also consider how high of quality do you think that paper was when it was turned in. So moving on, let's find out, so what's the solution if face-to-face has collaboration but no planning, and the divided approach has collaboration but no planning? How do we make sense of this and have best practice? Well, best practice is using layered approach to team writing. And so as a process, it's divided, so it builds on the divide and conquer approach, but it also has planned review built in by other team members. And so each team member takes a turn contributing to the project, making revisions in accreting layers. So you might start taking the lead on the introduction, let's say in that InRed paper. Charlotte revisits it, and then Stefan does the final kind of revisions at the end, with Tim maybe step in and do the top to bottom review just before the final submission. And so no ownership is given for those initial divisions. So the divisions just to get the work started. So it involves both planning and collaboration, taking advantage of those two features of teamwork that you really need to do for teamwork to function well: planning and collaboration. So as mentioned, this most closely resembles collaboration found in workplace settings. So that's another takeaway for you, that when you have an opportunity in a university setting to do teamwork together, you should be doing it not just to get the A or the B, whatever your goal is, and to do it as efficiently as possible so you can study for this other course, but you should really be trying to get the most out of the experience itself. So anyone can go on Wikipedia and Google a bunch of facts and figures, but the greatest benefit you can get on a team project in university is trying to implement these practices that resemble workplace settings, so that when you start a job, you can hit the ground running, and the learning curve isn't so much on dynamics of how to be on a team, but the learning curve is associated with joining that company and doing work in the way they've hired you to do. So, like any method, layered team writing has advantages and drawbacks. So no method is perfect. Let's take a look at looking at layered writing so you know what you're walking into when you attempt to use this. So in terms of planning, roles may be unequal in terms of effort. Maybe Charlotte really wants the A and she's very invested in the project material, so she's going to take a larger percentage of the planning effort. The other aspect is maybe too much planning is involved and you're not actually getting to the work portion. And so you can have a very robust, complex system to make sure that the divisions have review by everyone and you have check marks on a timeline and you have all these operations in place, but then 3 weeks have passed and you actually haven't started ideating on any of those elements of the team project. So planning can be one issue there. In terms of quality though, benefits here, it's high quality work because it's had the most eyes on all of the features of the final product. It maximizes contributions from the team, so even if you're a specialist in X and you look at content that's dealing with elements from Y, your expertise in X will still inform how people talk about Y in that case. And so it maximizes those contributions, gets you outside of your own head to draw from the brains of your team, which is really what teamwork's all about, is getting more input on an idea, maximizing the wisdom of teams to create quality products. And it mirrors workplace writing. So the sooner you can adapt and go through the learning curve in university, which is pretty low stakes setting, the greater impact you can have when you start the job after college. And so the final takeaway here is don't be like Scotty's team and be forced to redo your hard work the night before. You can do better than that. Divide and conquer may be seemingly efficient, but it's actually the least collaborative and may lead to problems down the road, specifically the night before it's due. So the module today I drew from this book, Team Writing by Joanna Wolf. She's an instructor here in the Rhetoric program at Carnegie Mellon, as well as Rebecca Burnett, also an alum from CMU but teaching elsewhere. And so just to conclude here, the mini lecture covered 4 aspects related to team writing. So we started by framing the lecture with your experiences in teamwork, talked about problems that most team projects have in terms of employer and professor expectations and what students actually do, as well as with problems that students find when they're writing on a team. And then finally, we gave you, in that last box there, options for collaborative writing in your teams. And while there are 3, depending on situation, you might need to do face-to-face, or maybe divide and conquer is appropriate. But layered approach is going to give you the highest quality product and take advantage of your teams. So I look forward to taking any questions you have via email or in class. And thank you for listening to this lecture. I'll look forward to seeing you again in the next mini module.